here it is, the one, the only, the ever-contentious thriller bark. I love how this arc dives straight into the fight against Absalom with a panel of Sanji as he cries out in relief with snot running down his nose upon retrieving Nami. Whenever there's snot, we can bet that he's really feeling it. It's played up for humor here, but a runny nose is actually highly indicative of Sanji's vulnerability in two key instances. First at Whole Cake Island, then second at Onigashima. When Luffy vocalizes Sanji's wish to save his biological family, and when Sanji cries for Robin's help, there's an absence of tears in both cases, yet his nose runs. It's a stark contrast from his usual outbursts in regard to Nami's safety in dangerous situations or seeing mermaids for the first time, where he's openly passionate. Vulnerability is frightening for Sanji, who habitually places himself lower than his loved ones, so he becomes tense in these moments where he considers himself to be acting selfishly. He tries to backpedal on his wish to Luffy, but asking for Robin's help is even scarier because there's no taking back his request once it's out there. It is so scary, yet such a relief after Robin answers him that he bursts into tears, and that's why I believe here, more than anywhere else, Sanji shows up at his bravest. Anyway, Sanji storms into the one-sided ceremony like a literal hurricane because that's how love always is, according to the East Blue. I think it's cute how Sanji and Nami crashed each other's no-good, very bad wedding, and it's fine that Nami isn't awake for this because she already knows the lengths Sanji will go for her. On the other hand, Sanji's awareness that Nami comes with a small detachment to Whole Cake Island for him is entirely necessary, as this heaps a sense of greater value onto his worth. Honestly though, I think this is a pretty funny fight. The humor works because it shows us for what it is, a showdown between two perverts. Regardless of how much worse one is than the other, they're both nasty. Starting from Thriller Bark, Sanji's perversion starts to ramp up, and although the gags do get out of hand at times, what he says in relation to it here is relevant to this day. Sanji is furious that Absalom has laid eyes and hands on the lovely ladies of his crew. Hypocrisy is in the air because Sanji did instigate the peeping all the way back in Arabasta, but that's kind of the point. Even so, there's a clear distinction between them. Absalom goes into his perversion for himself. He wants to find a pretty wife, so he'll go in and feel up a nice lass in the bats until he finds one to his liking. Sanji, on the other hand, keeps his most libidinous desires to himself because he knows they're wrong. A man of extremes like him struggles on the best of days before there faces temptation, but there's a hard line he will never cross which Absalom leaps over with glee. Every time his dream of invisibility surfaces, Sanji redirects himself to cover up the reason by talking about doing good and protecting people, which are still things he wants to do. It just so happens that there's a vice right there, ripe for the picking. This is where what I said about respectfully looking from a previous video comes into play. Sanji tries very hard to be as respectful as he can be. This is why he can claim with full confidence at Fishman Island that as much as he loves mermaids and would thrill in taking off with them, he would never do so. If nothing else, he will never lay a hand on a lady. On the flip side, we see in a bathhouse at Wano that he does not always succeed when it comes to not looking, and is rightly punished and called out for it by Nami. The narrative never justifies Sanji's urges, and he himself doesn't claim to be in the right as he kicks Absalom around. Instead, it's the principle of the matter. Absalom wronged Nami and Robin, so now he gets hit. As an aside, there is a popular theory that Sanji's dream of claiming the clear fruit stemmed from the wish to become invisible as a trauma response at Germa. I think there are reasonable grounds for this, because the clear fruit stood out enough for him to recall its existence in his teenage years. At the same time, I believe his dream of perversion is still a genuine fantasy of his, because, alas and alack, he carries it out to fruition in Wano. In other words, I subscribe to the belief that all versions of the dream are true. In any case, wacky as Sanji's fight is, Zoro's "nothing happened" elevates this arc and has an incredible ripple effect that impacts Sanji's interpersonal dynamics within the crew. Much as Sanji talks himself down to Brook about how he looks silly, his actions have profoundly affected Brook and Robin, who have the esoteric knowledge of what went down with Kuma. It's no coincidence that these two truly see Sanji for who he is, which makes Brook's speech about Sanji's kindness when he squares off against Big Mom all the more staggering. It's everything, in the same way Robin appreciates the depths of Sanji's cry for help from Black Maria. As for Zoro, I think the fact that he nearly sacrifices his life to protect the crew is extremely harrowing for Sanji, partly because it harkens back to what happened with Zeph on the Rock. It's been evident ever since his fight with Kurobi that Sanji will do anything to protect his loved ones. He wouldn't have minded death because his self-image is that of the failure and the cook. The failure has no inherent worth, while cooks are a dime a dozen, and therefore dispensable. Having someone hurt on his worthless behalf is a pain more excruciating than any other for Sanji, who fears Zoro might be dead by the time he opens his eyes again. And this becomes Zoro's moment, but Kuma also acknowledges Sanji's part by all but sending him to Ivankov once it's time to separate the Straw Hats. Considering the history Kuma shares with Ivankov, this is a very significant choice he makes for Sanji, so Sanji is eventually given credit for his kindness in the scene in all the ways that matter by those in the know. And then we approach Sabaody Archipelago. I love how Sanji's delinquency rears its ugly head in his struggles to recall whom he's crossed over the years. He's very prone to getting into fights. And here we see Sanji use Nami's name to cover up his anger over his crew getting dragged into his mess with Duval. Picking a fight with him is one thing because he will fight back, but involving his found family is another story entirely. It's also funny how he takes his own advice and parts his hair differently while growing an anchor beard 2 years later. The fact that it's called the anchor is kinda cute. The running joke now, reinforced by Duval, is that Sanji attracts only men, but he does actually start winning hearts in the New World. He at least gets Viola to blush, and then there's Pudding. I feel like Paradise is where we see who he is, while the New World is where he gets his true coming of age when the person he is faces challenges. Not just because he's lacking per se, but because there are certain walls that must come down for Sanji to move forward. And that's why it looks like he takes so many losses in rapid succession after the time skip, when in fact the narrative does give him some wins to go along with them. And together they build up to his identity crises from Whole Cake Island to Wano, with the results of his growth as seen in Egghead. Sanji's familiar worry makes itself known at Sabaody Archipelago proper when Zoro collapses during their escape from the Pacifistas. Once again, Sanji's words are unreliable toward men because he very easily leaves Nami's side to look after his injured crewmate, especially knowing what Zoro is really shouldering. Sanji is pretty soft on Zoro from this point onward because I haven't mentioned it in 2 videos, so I have to bring it up again now. On Punk Hazard, he recognizes that Zoro is being hard on himself and advocates for him as he leads the G5 Marines. Also, I will never get over how Usopp tries to shield Sanji and the utter devastation on Sanji's face when Usopp disappears before his eyes. This is Sanji's worst nightmare come true. Usopp does such a brave thing, and he seemingly perishes in defense of a worthless failure who can't protect anyone. It's the worst way for that fight to end for him, and that's what makes the nature and order of the disappearances at Kuma's hands so effective. Zoro goes first, and everything falls apart from there, because in a lot of ways, Zoro is the rock of the crew. Sanji plunges into despair and pulls on his hair after Usopp vanishes. He loses his head to grief insofar that he blatantly ignores Luffy's pleading order to withdraw. This is heartbreaking, because Luffy's words come from a place of love, of how much value he places upon Sanji, who's lost all sense of himself in the harrowing tragedy of the moment. Now, the Iraqi horror show is the inspiration for the Okama, but I haven't actually watched it, so I am not qualified to speak at length on that. However, I will say this. Kamabaka's people are said to have hearts of maidens. I'm not going to dissect exactly what that means because I am not Oda-sensei and can't speak for his adoption of the phrase in his work, but Sanji says in his refusal to wear the dress that he has the heart of a man. Not that he's manlier or more of a man than them. Those are creative localizations. He's using their vernacular to explain his identity to them in no uncertain terms. He doesn't actually condemn who they are because his argument is that he wants to love ladies, not be friends with them. It has nothing to do with the Okama, and I think his exaggerated frustration with them largely stems from their trying to force him into doing things he doesn't want. Otherwise, he treats them just fine when he's dining with Ivankov, and they're important enough to have made Big Mom's hostage list. Incidentally, I think his stint in heels here contributes to how well he runs in Nami's shoes on Punk Hazard, which is a hilarious thought. The bridal arts are truly helpful, even by proxy. Sanji's expression upon decoding Luffy's message is quite tender. He was very worried about his captain, and for Luffy and the crew he vows to get stronger by accepting Ivankov's deal. As absurd as it sounds on the surface, I think this is a pretty big deal for Sanji to strike, because Ivankov's taunt is whether Sanji's heart of a man will sustain itself in a dress. For the record, men can wear and be anything they want. However, in this case, the dress has been symbolic for the Okama, whose way Sanji has already turned away ever since his unintended arrival on the island. In other words, from a purely narrative standpoint, he risks changing his heart for Luffy's sake. Gags aside, that's the true enormity of what he goes through within the next 2 years. With this, my audio commentary series on the Jump character remix of Sanji has concluded. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have yourself a wonderful day.